The Germans were very deep into the occult, into the black magic, into all these things that the media would prefer not to talk about. A lot of this supposedly came up during the Nuremberg trials, and it all was stricken out of the record. The Germans were fascinated with the South Pole, and Hans Hubriger was an author and a philosopher that Hitler and all the other SS men and Nazi men were crazy about. Hubriger had this philosophy of the fire and ice, that the German character, which is the New World Order, the Illuminati philosophy of creating the Supermensch of the future, that only the fire and ice of the harsh polar conditions can toughen the steel character of the Supermensch of the future. And this is the second reason that they went after the South Pole. A third and bigger reason lies deep into the German mythology about the Thule people. When Greenland was still not under ice, there was a tall, blonde, Nordic-looking race that lived there, and later moved to the inner of the earth, and still lives there, flying their saucers, much more advanced than their lagging, should I call them, Helga, should I call them retarded brothers on the surface of the planet. And so it has been the secret dream of the Germans on the surface to find and to reunite with their more advanced Aryan brothers from the inner earth, according to German and secret SS mythology. So I talked to a psychic about a year ago. I mean, this is a collection of anthropological rumors and legends. Some of these I can prove, like a photograph of a German spacesuit. Others I cannot, but I never debunk or disprove or discard anything. So according to the psychic, Hitler did 2 expeditions to the inner earth, one in the late 30s with a specially equipped submarine that was attempting to enter the North Polar water opening to the inner earth. They found the opening, and it's about probably several hundred kilometers to possibly 1,000 kilometers in diameter. And they started going inside, but they encountered very strong cross currents. Didn't want to submerge because they did not know what lies underneath. And they reached a moment where their submarine could proceed no more against these heavy currents. According to rumor, there are strong force field shields, defenses at the openings, run by the races in the inner earth that basically do not want much of contact with us, the lesser developed savages on the surface. Another attempt was made in the 42-43 with a anti-gravity powered cigar-shaped 2-seater craft, smaller version of the giant mothership. And it makes sense because the Germans were always making small models of the much larger airplanes that they did. By the way, I'm chasing a rumor that they had an Arado flying boat that could carry 720 fully armed soldiers. I just heard the rumor, and I think I have something in the drawing. I'm looking for a photograph for this mystery plane of the Germans. Back to the South Pole, they always did smaller models of bigger engines or craft. So with this 2-seater cigar-shaped anti-gravity craft, they were finally successfully able to enter the inner earth and to contact the inner earthlings there. That was the third reason for the Germans to drive to the South Pole. And the more obvious reason was that they were losing the war in Germany, and ever since the United States entered the war, it became obvious to anybody who had some international cosmopolitan education in Germany that they would lose the war. To every German plane produced and flown in the air, there were 5 Allied planes. We have seldom been told these statistics, that the Germans had less than, about 1/5 of the planes. Probably the ratios of artillery, of tanks, and of other armaments were not much different. They were bound to lose that war. They didn't have the industrial capacity to match the Americans, the British, and the Russians. I mean, in the end of the war, British and Russians could freely bomb Germany with almost impunity. They couldn't reach anything of the Russian mega continent, very little of England, and nothing of the United States. I mean, they were bound to lose that war. So they basically decided to lose the European war in order to win the South Polar War. This is the same, I think. Yeah. So in the late 30s, in 1936, the SS party did a excellent 4-year plan for the colonization of the South Pole. The 4-year plan, very detailed plan. They were showing the areas without any snow. It's okay. Without any snow. And we see the seal of the first German Antarctic expedition, 1938-39. We see here quietly the oak leaves of the, this is oak, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The oak leaves of the Thule Society. It was under the sponsorship of the secret patronage of the Thule Society. They descended on the South Pole. This is a letter of congratulations signed by Göring, the Reichsmarshal of Aviation, to the members of the South Polar expedition. And one may think, how come that the aviation Reichsminister is interested in the South Polar expedition, unless they were preparing to build some bases there for the Luftwaffe. The motor ship, the research ship Schwabenland, was launching flying boats that were scouting the South Polar continent and staking their claims. They didn't even bother to land at all places. They would just drop flags with heavy poles. That was enough by international convention. And then they would register their claims with the International Court of Hague. And this is how, in 38-39, the Germans became the legal owners of a chunk of real estate, probably as big as 2/3 of Europe, south of South Africa, on the South Pole. Here are members of the expedition staking the claim. Much later, photographs appeared in the late 40s of the German colony in the Neuschwabenland from an altitude way above and beyond the altitude of the biggest stratospheric bombers at the time, which was about 10-12 kilometers. This is an altitude of 60-70 kilometers, maybe 100 kilometers, basically Earth's orbit. And the speculation is that this is a photograph of the German South Polar colony from a saucer, from that height.
That coastal region?
Excuse me?
That coastal region?
Yeah, close to the coastal region. This is a photograph of the German Space Control Center on the South Pole. At the beginning I thought, nah, it looks kind of cylindrical cavern like the insides of a U-boat. But then somebody observed, well, how come then this guy is standing inclined 45 degrees if this is a U-boat? And then we realized that this is a fisheye type wide-angle lens, one of the first such for photography. Probably in the late 40s the Germans had such lenses then, which means that this is a much larger room. Examining the screens here, we see that these are round cathode ray tube, possibly radar screens, which jive with the vintage late 40s, early 50s. They did not have the square computer screens at the time. And all the other equipment is clearly analog needle type measuring meters, which basically is the state of the art in the late 40s, early 50s.
That look like rock formations on the wall?
Excuse me?
Does that look like rock formations further down?
Here?
Yeah.
Good point. Good point. If this is an underground thing. How could the Germans do that? How could they move so much stuff to the South Pole? Simple logistics. I mean, I had this question again. How can you do that if you are the Kriegsmarine chief of operations? It was so hard for Admiral Byrd to go there in the 20s and 30s, until a friend of mine told me, who is a U-boat buff, Henry Stevens from the German Research Project, one of the persons that has helped me tremendously in my research. He discovered that there were German transport submarines that could hold 5,000 tons, that were 5,000 deadweight tons, which is about 2.5 times as much as the standard Allied Liberty class transport ships. The Germans had 2.5 times bigger submarines than the Allies were building surface ships. These submarines were so huge they could carry bulk cargo, they could carry personnel, they could carry armaments, anything. They were building them in sections on assembly lines in several dry docks at incredible speed. And from 42 on, about 100 submarines were allocated for, I mean, quite a sizable number of submarines were allocated for service in the South Pacific, basically the South Polar Colony. Admiral Dönitz and the SS Elite decided to start building the last bastion after the fortifications that they were building in the Alps, preparing for a last stand in 44 and 45. They obviously had one more line of defense, which was their South Polar Colony. After the war ended, it became clear that about 100 of these submarines mysteriously disappeared. They were never scuttled, bombed, torpedoed, or surrendered by their crews. They just disappeared into thin air, a whole fleet of 100 submarines. Some of them resurfaced with skeleton crews of about a dozen men in Argentina after they departed from Kiel and with fully loaded with hundreds of people on board. And little by little the story emerged that the Germans have been cooking something big on the South Pole. The biggest breakthrough came for me when I discovered the secret. This was the magical key to the German South Polar Kingdom. This is a submarine propulsion drive made by Walter, engineer Walter, was the same inventor who built the Walter rocket engine for the Messerschmitt 163 rocket plane, the Comet. And the same engine was also used for the Schriever rocket-propelled saucer that probably flew at 4,000 kilometers an hour, 4 times the speed of sound. Admiral Reichsmarshal of Aviation Göring is rumored to have climbed and flown one of these saucers. So what Walter discovered was a typical German engineering genius. He made an underwater rocket. He basically made the submarine to carry its oxidizer on board as the rocket carries its oxidizer on board. It had the usual tanks of diesel fuel and another tank for the oxidizer called Ingolin, in the name of his son, Ingo, or whatever his name was, which was hydrogen peroxide. Simple hydrogen peroxide that they were using for the drive for the fuel pumps for the V2 rocket, or as the fuel of the Walter rocket engine for the Messerschmitt Comet rocket plane. And there would be a fuel pump similar to the one in the V2 rocket engine, fuel pump that would pump the fuel and the oxidizer into the reaction chamber, into the burning chamber. The oxidizer, through these regulating valves, this is a triplex pump, a three-flow pump. The oxidizer would come to the reaction chamber and through a catalyst, I don't know, I forgot what was the catalyst for hydrogen peroxide, but silver or some simple substance, would decompose it explosively into, very energetically, into hydrogen and oxygen. We have a ready-made fuel and oxidizer. And they would be sprayed into the burning chamber together with the fuel. We have a spark plug. The mixture would ignite and drive a standard gas turbine. There was a smaller gas turbine for the reverse, direct drive shaft. Actually, probably with some reductor because that's too much RPMs for the poor propeller. Then, another genius invention here. Then the exhaust gases would be condensed to a liquid phase, cooled and condensed in a condenser using cheap, free cold water from the ocean. And the remaining residue, some of it would be pumped back into the fuel pump for reuse. And the rest, the condenser water, this was a separator that would separate the useful phase from the used ones. And this that was not needed would be pumped in a liquid phase behind the submarine, thus eliminating even the air bubbles behind it, the gas wave, the bubbles behind the submarine, which gave the Germans unlimited key to the world oceans. This is basically a nuclear-powered submarine. In a 5,000-ton submarine, you have enough space for the fuel tanks to circle the globe. If you can't make one full circle, they have milk cows, the milking cows, the submarine tenders for other submarines. They would dock somewhere. I don't know whether they could do underwater docking and transfer of fuel, but if they could do that, which is no big deal after all, they would have been really invincible. So they could depart from Kiel, getting out from their underwater pen entries to their underground submarine pen, travel the whole ocean without resurfacing to breathe oxygen, maybe few quick resurfacing for navigation if they did not have good inertial compasses. They would go under the ice sheet of the South Pole, which is the biggest hurdle, and this has been one of the biggest problems with all other expeditions, and enter into the underwater entries of their underground submarine pens and then resurface inside, where it's warm, never freezes, and they could be drinking their coffee all throughout the cruise without any interference by enemy planes or submarine chasing ships. This is the key to the South Polar Colony, the German South Polar Colony. With these giant 5,000-ton transport submarines, they could move any number of material and people with impunity. We have not to forget that the tachyon drives that they were using for the flying saucers, basically the color converter could provide unlimited electric energy to their submarines. So that is another system, even more advanced than this one, because this one still needs the hydrogen peroxide and the diesel fuel as fuel. The other ones were free energy submarines that could circle forever. They were more advanced than even the nuclear submarines of the present day. But the Americans and the Russians tried in the mid-50s with great difficulty to build such a hydrogen peroxide submarine, the Walter cycle submarine. They each built one and abandoned them because the nuclear-powered submarines were already coming in service. Almost 15 years after the Germans successfully tried that. They had about a dozen submarines of different models that were running on the Walter principle, something that has been very little talked about. Late into the 60s and 70s, identified submarines have been observed in the world's oceans. Here we see the shade of a chaser anti-submarine plane. These are probably the submarines of the South Polar Colony. According to rumor, they have nuclear-powered submarines. I doubt that these are nuclear-powered submarines. These are probably free-energy color converter submarines. Maybe better for you if you don't see everything. There are some chairs over there. Another very interesting photograph is a Horten Brothers turbojet flying wing of an advanced series where the cabin is jutting forward in a very strange white camouflage. Has anybody seen a white German camouflage painting? I have not. Even in their campaign in Norway, they use standard kind of mixed camouflage painting. I have a feeling that this plane was rated for shipment to the South Pole, and this is where they needed this white camouflage. This is a dead giveaway of their South Pole preparation. This is a model more advanced than the other model that flew, where the tip of the plane is like this. The only other plane that flew in Germany. I have a feeling that this one was tested and shipped and crated and shipped to the South Pole Colony. Admiral Byrd in his diary talks about his 1946-47 expedition to the South Pole and his meeting with the inner Earthlings there, but let us see whether he was after the inner Earthlings or after somebody else. Photographs from space depicting something strange on the pole, kind of a big hole. Here we see the hole even better. However, I have a feeling that this is probably some way the camera works. Basically, it's not taking photographs here. Maybe on purpose, still on purpose, just to cover up the real hole. Because this hole is so big, it goes down as far south as almost, the state of Montana or something, if you calculate the... Not this one here, I'm sorry. This hole would go as far south as I was kind of trying to figure out by the contours of the continents that were visible, and this is kind of a too big of a hole.
Big as dinner?
Yeah, much bigger than... If there is a hole, it's a lot smaller. Or maybe it's in another dimension. I'm sorry. So Admiral Byrd went to the South Pole chasing something. Some almost tabloid rumors about Hitler being alive, combined with our study of the German U-boat research and development, and Admiral Byrd's expeditions, chasing somebody there in 46-47, clearly show that a lot more is going on the South Pole than the media, the illuminated media here is willing to admit, the party line media. What exactly is going on the South Pole? I think we can change slides. Admiral Byrd went to the South Pole in the 20s, 27, 28, then in the 30s, 57, to Little America. Little America is south of, well, right on the German presence is in Neuschwabenland, which is south of South Africa. Little America is on the opposite side of Neuschwabenland, so it becomes south of the Pacific somewhere, south of Australia.
It was 1939. Second expedition.
Yeah. I found some second-hand, some used bookstore volumes on that expedition. for $80, and I'm probably going to get them because they have some very interesting photographs there. In 46-47, which is the second South Polar summer, the first summer after the war was the winter, our winter of 45-46, which was too close. They did not have enough time to prepare. Just 3 months after the war ended in Japan in September 45. It was too fast for them. They probably had not investigated yet. The intelligence services have not realized the full amount of the German presence there. So a year and several months later, in the next South Polar summer, which is the winter for us of 46-47, Admiral Byrd put together an armada of 4,000 men, armed ships, submarines, armed Coast Guard icebreakers, armed supply ships. There were Russian and British contingents in that flotilla. Obviously, it was an Allied attempt. It was labeled a peaceful expedition for exploration of the South Pole, and we would see the shortened version of the film later on. However, in this peaceful expedition, we see the advancing American forces peacefully storming the white fields of the South Pole, yeah, with their amphibious vehicles and other tracked unit. These are personnel carriers and other amphibious vehicles. It was a massive army operation, army and only army. Very few scientists were involved. By the time the operation finished, they have overflown most of the South Pole. But interestingly enough, I mean, South Africa is here. This is Neuschwabenland, south of South Africa. The Little America is on the opposite side of the South Pole, where Admiral Byrd went all the 3 times. And they flew mostly over this part of the South Pole, which is exactly the opposite part of where the Germans were. Is this a coincidence? Couldn't they figure a simple map of the South Pole and figure out the right coast to land there? I don't think that they wanted to find the Germans. I think this whole expedition was a whitewash for the military guys who were pressing, for this faction of the American government that was pressing for attack on the Germans there. Hey, how come? I mean, we just beat them in the war, and you want to leave them to remain there, get stronger and stronger, and then come after us? This is the time to hit them when they are the weakest. This was their argument. However, on a much higher level, the German presence on the South Pole has been brokered by the unified terrestrial Illuminati government. The higher we go in the conspiracies, the more the secret societies of two viciously fighting a life and death struggle. Two fighting nations their secret societies become the best of buddies. Another map coming from American sources clearly shows that Admiral Byrd flew mostly over areas where there was no German presence, and he flew nothing over the areas where the Germans the area that the Germans have staked for their possession, the Queen Maud Land. There were very little flights over the Queen Maud Land. Admiral Byrd lost in about 2 weeks most of his planes and retreated in disgrace and made an unauthorized interview, which probably cost him his career, in Argentina on his way back, quite probably, refueling or reloading with supplies in an Argentinian port. He had the lack of political insight to make this politically incorrect interview, saying that I think the next World War will be with an adversary that comes from the polar regions and that has the ability to fly unobstructed from pole to pole. Clearly talking about the German South Polar presence, and their ability to outfly anything the Americans could confront them with. Some of the planes were shot directly by the saucers. Others were hit by beam weapons. They didn't know what hit them. Third, collided with invisible barriers and disintegrated in mid-flight by reports of other planes nearby, which was obvious that the Germans had already installed the force field shields around their colony. This whole operation was meant to show to that faction of the American military that, well, see guys, we can't do anything because they are a lot more powerful than us. Only the highest circles of the American government and the members of the secret societies knew that actually the German presence on the South Pole will become a joint project between Russia, United States, and Germany. I mean, in the German colony there. And secretly they would be involved in the future projects of space flight for anti-gravity, time travel. The Germans developed the time machine much earlier than the Americans did. They did so with the nuclear bombs too. The rumor is, in one of the tapes that we did with Al Bilik, Al talks at length about stories that actually the two bombs dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki were German-made, that were captured in the underground caves by the Americans. The American bomb was made of a giant howitzer barrel where they would shoot at each other two subcritical masses of plutonium. It was so heavy that no bomber could lift it in the air. That's why the original design was to come hide it in a ship or on board a submarine, take it inside a port and explode it there. And there's a very interesting story that came to my attention, a very strange explosion in Fort Chicago, which is north of South San Francisco, about half a year before the supposedly first test at Alamogordo. According to rumor, there were two unsuccessful tests before Fort Chicago where the bomb couldn't go critical. It was a flop. And the Fort Chicago was the first successful test of an American nuclear device. It was hidden on board a ship that was loaded with ammunition by 300 black servicemen. And they all departed with the explosion. There are researchers that have very carefully investigated the whole story. They claim that it was a nuclear explosion. There was no chunk of metal that was found of the ammunition ship or of the ship that was anchored across the bay or from a 20-ton locomotive, diesel locomotive that was parked on the tracks. Not a single big enough chunk was found. They were basically disintegrated. This could never happen by a normal ammunition explosion. Plus, it was a white fiery ball. When ammunition explodes, the most you can get high up in the temperature is either reddish or orange, or the most it will be yellowish gaseous ball. This was a white gaseous ball. But it was still a flop because it produced a tidal wave of only 30 feet, which is about 10 meters, 3-story tall tidal wave. No big deal. I mean, any small boat would send that, not to say a word about giant battleship. They realized that if they take such bomb in a Japanese harbor and explode it, it wouldn't do much damage other than drowning whatever number of sailors on the... There would be damage, but nothing compared to the Hiroshima bomb. Anyway, stories that the Hiroshima and the Nagasaki bombs were German-made, and that at the time the Germans were working on a pineapple-sized bomb, according to Al Bilik, big enough to destroy London or New York. We know that you cannot do that with a nuclear bomb of that time. One would not be enough. My suspicion is that such a small bomb could be made only either with the element 115 that was given to the Germans by the little grays or by some other alien race, or by antimatter. And Hitler decided not to use these bombs probably by the same reason that he decided not to kill all the British that were left stranded at Dunkirk at the beginning of the war.
He didn't really want war with England anyway. Hitler didn't want war with England to begin with.
Not only that, but when his generals proposed to smash all the Brits there, he said, no, gentlemen, you're missing the big point. We are not fighting, we are not in war with Aryans. We are not in the business of killing Aryans. Hitler was after a lot higher targets, goals of levels that border on the alien presence on the planet and the presence of celestial management structures that go way beyond the terrestrial small-time politics. He was in the business of killing Slavs, that's for sure. That was the reason he decided not to bomb London or New York, after all. We have discovered here that they had the ICBMs ready at the time, and if the nuclear bombs were ready, I mean, all these cities could have been obliterated just with 2 shots. Anyway, in this documentary film came also the information about a giant naval warfare size craft, the Honeybull 3 craft, that was 74-meter diameter, which is about 220 feet diameter. This is bigger than a football field. It was armed with 1, 2, 3, 4 naval caliber triple gun turrets, and it was meant to fight whole armadas, weighing probably many thousands of tons. Only one of these craft was built, and at the end of the war, Germany decided to make a final desperate attempt to win one more alien support to their cause. So they departed on a search for alien partners on a no-return suicide flight to Mars. The extremely strong electromagnetic field of the drives was making the alloy brittle only after several months of flight, and they knew that the craft would not be able to land on Mars and then come back to Earth again. So a large crew of volunteer German and Japanese officers were chosen, and the craft departed in April 1945, a month before the war ended in Germany, for Mars. Because of the low level of automation on board, probably a lot of the things were done manually, so they needed a large number of crew. But with a limitless free energy on board coming from the color converters, they could afford to do electrolytic purification of the air, of the water, to take the urine and to recycle the water. And with some hothouses, they could produce their own vegetables and food. Drawings of a much larger craft, this is probably 150 to 200 meters diameter, probably 500-600 feet diameter, were also found on the drawing board. This was armed by double-decker gun turrets, smaller calibers underneath, bigger calibers above. This may even be a triple-decker gun turret here with the machine guns on top, a second and a third deck, and a double-decker turret on top, without the authors of the film being sure whether this project was pursued or not. But the drawings were there. And this is a drawing of the planet Mars with the Honeybull 3 craft approaching. Because of the weaker gravitational field of Mars, Mars has a smaller diameter than we do, and of the weakened alloys of the drive system, they couldn't squeeze the top power from the color converters, and they couldn't crank the power of the anti-gravity drives high enough. They were worried that they may just disintegrate. On top of that, the Martian atmosphere is thinner than the terrestrial atmosphere, but fully breathable. so they couldn't use it much for air braking. So they had a very heavy crash landing on Mars, and they destroyed the drives. But the craft survived. And this happened in the middle of January 1946, after 8 months of heavy flight. April 45 to January, mid-January 46. And they probably radioed their arrival message to their South Polar colony. And this is their story of the flight to Mars. Quite probably they coasted to Mars after an initial strong push in the stronger terrestrial gravity field. The rest was just coasting down to Mars, and they turned on the drives in the very last moment before approaching Mars. I mean, all of these designs that the Germans had were basically fly 1 hour and repair 3 weeks type of primitive constructions, as all of the prototype designs are. So it is obvious that they couldn't win the war with 20 of these advanced craft. If they had 200 of them or 2,000, it would have been a different story, and all our children would be wearing today the Hitlerjugend kerchiefs around, not the Boy Scout kerchiefs, and wearing the swastika armbands here. But it really doesn't make much sense, because if you think about it, the Russian pioneers, the Russian Youth Communist Organization, and the North Korean, the Kim Il-sung's pioneers, and the Hitlerjugend in Germany, the Hitler's pioneers, and the Boy Scouts here in this country have uniforms as if they were copied one from the other. I mean, carbon copies one of the other. And we start thinking, I mean, what is this invisible hand that pulls the string behind the scenes? Why is the youth of the whole planet indoctrinated in very similar ways? But we'll come to that in a minute. So to even the score, probably the anti-German faction in the American government got the upper hand again. So in 1958, under the guise of the International Geophysical Year, a whole flotilla of Navy ships descended on the South Pole. And according to the German documentary film, 3 nuclear-tipped rockets were fired in the late August, early September at the German colony on the South Pole from the American ships. And they don't say what happened. My speculation is that the Illuminati were just playing little tricks on each other. The left Illuminati hand was using the German scare and the German presence on the South Pole to convince the right illuminated hand, the Russian and the American governments, that they should spend more on armaments and warfare, and they should dig these underground shelters a little bit faster, because the Germans may come and attack and conquer us. The real reason for the underground shelters was much different. My research into the British Imperial War Museum and some other museums proved that the first prototypes of ICBMs that the Americans built, almost 15 years after the Germans built their first ICBM, were tested intensively, and in the end of the program, 3 of them were fired with nuclear warheads in the South Atlantic, which is just close to the south, to the German colony in Neuschwabenland, in the year, same year, 1958. Whether the authors of the film basically speculate, or whether nobody on board the American ship knew the destination, nobody other than the armaments engineer who had the codes for the destination with him. It is quite probable to shoot a nuclear rocket without anybody on the ship realizing where it is headed for. It's probable even to shoot a rocket with a nuclear warhead without the ship knowing that it's a real, the real thing and not a dummy warhead. My feeling is that the Germans had their force field defense well in place at the time, and simply this was a little Illuminati experiment. Let's have our left hand, the Germans with a force field shield in the South Polar colony. do a little test with our Reich and the American Nuclear Strike Force and see that basically we can stop dead in the tracks all the radiation coming from the explosion. That's exactly what happened. The rockets either disintegrated upon impact with the force field shields, or they may have even exploded just to test the ability of the force field shields to withstand radiation. The Germans developed a lot of other bizarre weaponry that I have heard only rumors about. Let's go quickly over what I've heard about the Germans developing. On top of the sonic lasers that they use for digging their tremendous underground cities and caverns, they developed a death ray, a greenish radiation that was tested in Romania with devastating results against some Russian troops. Everything was packed, crated, and shipped to the South Polar Colony after that. Another rumor tells that one of the convoys of German ships that was escaping to the South Pole at the end of the war was confronted by a big Allied armada, and then the Germans unleashed the beam weapons that they had been keeping exactly for such purpose. And one of the few survivors, all the ships sunk, just few men survived. One of the survivors said, "I wish that we would never be confronted by the same inferno that we were." Other reports were saying that the Germans created some light emitting rocket drives, and an unmanned laser propulsion rocket reached the moon in 1938. This must have been an extremely secret project that was not run from Peenemünde, as were most of the Saucer projects. They were run from even more secret SS and army establishments and by private funding, by private groups. Other rumors of advanced German weaponry, we just mentioned the nuclear bombs and the antimatter bombs developed in Germany. I heard that they produced a time machine at the end of the war. They were also working on the Philadelphia technology of their U-boats. But because they were trying this technology at the time when the U-boats were moving, the Eldridge experiment in the Philadelphia dry docks that Albilik is talking about, the Eldridge was stationary. So the Germans introduced one more component in the equation which screwed up the whole balance, and they lost all the U-boats. They could not bring them back. So the stories about the German U-boats surfacing last year in 1992 and captured by the American Navy, and the German sailors were puzzled when they saw this way more advanced ship on the horizon. The Americans were puzzled when they saw on the German captain's message board the calendar of 1943 hanging there on the board. The Germans still thought that it's 1943. For them it was just disappearing from 43 and reappearing in our time. So basically they did a jump in time, similar to the Philadelphia side product when the Eldridge went forward in time. The Germans were also working on free energy, and our deep throat from Argentina mentioned that in 1952 a German engineer built a cold fusion power plant for Juan Perón, and it went online. There is even a debunking reference to that in the Wall Street Journal some time ago.
Did it say where it was located?
No, but we've been investigating the story. It's probably all over the Argentinian press from 1952. Also, the Germans developed a lot of beam weapons, not only the death ray, but also the sonic cannon. And if you remember Bill Cooper, the American military was trying to fight the little grays by shooting sonic beams at them, sonic beam weapons, because that would shatter a steel plate at whatever distance away from the transmitter, because they did not have defenses against these sonic shields, sonic beams. And this is a drawing of how such a sonic cannon might have worked. It would kill soldiers instantly nearby, render them paralyzed or disoriented far away. It was a mass area weapon that would kill a whole division in literally a few seconds. And I'm proud to present the first photograph ever of a German beam weapon. These are massive steel parabolic antennas. It was so simple. They would pump methane gas and oxygen in front of the antenna and suddenly ignite it. And the explosion would create a powerful shock wave that propagates forward. And they would continue this process. It would be working cyclically. And the net result would be a massive death rate among the invading forces. And this is a book on the history of the CIA. It is hard to imagine the CIA faking the Germans inventing the first beam weapon on the planet, at least in our civilization. A puzzled American engineer contemplates the contraption that he has just found. These are quite large diameter. I mean, this is a small one, smaller one. This is a much bigger diameter. So, Neuschwabenland, right here south of South Africa, this is where the Germans are. About the hollow earth theory, I'm quite skeptical, but I have to admit, I quickly did a database search of my memory, and I realized that I could not remember a photograph from space of the polar regions. Not a single photograph. Actually, this is the only one that I found. Even funnily enough, in a 1-inch thick volume that was published recently, basically the New World Order contribution by the Russian and American and other space establishment. Cosmonauts and astronauts from all over the world discussing how beautiful the Earth looks from space and how it is one planet, and how after the second, the fifth, or the 10th turn around it, one realizes that it's our planet, a global planet. It's a globalistic book. Exactly the type of book that the New World Order desperately needs. The only photograph that was cut, the corner was missing, was this photograph. And the only place that it was cut through the South Pole. Usually editors cut the photographs if they have to put some other thing. However, this corner was left empty. There was absolutely no reason for them to cut the photograph. And it was out of style because all the other photographs were rectangular. This was quite an expensive glossy volume. Why the hell would you put a photograph with one corner missing? And they have cut it right through the South Pole. Very suspicious for me. If anybody can find a photograph of the South Pole, I'll be very glad to have a copy of that. I couldn't find anything there. It could have been airbrushed. There could be nothing. But still, the fact that the pole is missing from our databases is quite suspicious. A friend of mine told me that his friend in Germany tape recorded from the television a weather report where the northern hemisphere and the northern pole were visible in infrared light, but nobody it was a German satellite, not an American satellite. That's why it probably leaked through the censorship. The satellite guys didn't catch anything. The TV station guys didn't catch anything, and the weather reporter didn't catch anything. While they were talking about snow and blizzards over Germany, the people realized that the North Pole had a kind of a circular something there that should not be there, a hole or something. So I'm trying to get the copy of that film from Germany. Suddenly at midnight, maybe a designer leak similar to the shuttle footage tape of the UFOs battling it out in our atmosphere with beam weapons. A little bit about conspiracy theories. Coming from Eastern Europe, I consider myself a super conspiratologist. I believe in the multi-layered, hierarchical, multi-tiered, pyramidal structure, conspiratorial power centers on this planet and way beyond the planet. We are just a small bolt, a small cog in the bigger machine. But we will talk about the bigger conspiracies in a minute. Let's talk about the smaller level conspiracies. The Paperclip Conspiracy, The Secret Agenda, and several other books, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, definitely paint a much more different picture than our media has told us. Wall Street turns out to be the biggest financial factor, the biggest financier of the rise of the Third Reich. Why would the American Illuminati want the German Third Reich to succeed? Why? All these books depict how thousands of Nazis were smuggled in the United States with fake IDs, with changed autobiographies, given fake names, because by law one cannot bring into the country and give immigration visa and especially work status to a person who was a member of a totalitarian party, be it a Nazi or a communist party. They were all brought with false identity, and they started working on crash projects. Engineers, scientists, SS specialists, the CIA here in the KGB over there were trained by SS specialists and Gestapo specialists. The propaganda spin controllers here and in Russia were trained by how should I say, their tutors and spiritual teachers from the Goebbelsian Ministry of Propaganda, from the Goebbelsian Ministry of Love, to use the Orwellian doublespeak. So, can we raise it back? Just raise the whole thing a little bit. In this article from Denver Post, we see that after the war, a lot of German engineers escaped in Spain and started building electromagnetic rockets, which is a code word for electromagnetically driven flying saucers for Franco, and spies from the whole world were trying to catch up with them. The best enemy money could buy. How Wall Street paid for the rise of the Bolshevik Revolution. They created the whole heavy industry in Russia. Arm & Hammer and the like funneled money through Trotsky, who was the ex-Wall Street broker and the bagman for the Bolshevik Revolution. He was married to a daughter of the German banking family, the Schiff family.
Yeah, I've been instructed that we're going to take a break about now. Is that correct? 3:30? So
How is the tape going on?
Oh, it's fine. We're one. This is another hour. That's the verdict.
Yeah.
Yes,
We've got another hour.
Break.
We'll have another hour.
Break.
Okay. Well, I was just asked to stop you.
Are we doing a break?
Early.
It's either way is fine with me.
Well, we can go another hour or do a break. What does everybody want to do? I'm not the decision maker in this process.
Is everybody all right? Let's keep on going.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's go for another hour.
Excellent. I'll just open for a while. This would be our air break.
Okay.
We would open the hatch.
Thank you. Sorry to stop it, but
Submarine with the windows open.
That's it. So, the best enemy money could buy. Standard Oil of somewhere built all the Volga oil platforms that Hitler was after in his Battle of Stalingrad. Ford Motor Company built the armor truck factory in Moscow, which became the backbone of the Russian automotive industry. General Electric built the dynamo factory for heavy electrical machinery, which became the backbone of the Russian electrotechnical industry. International Harvester built the Kirov tractor plant, which became the backbone of the Russian tractor industry and the tank industry. During the war, they were churning out T-34s on the assembly line built by the Americans. And on and on and on. We can go forever. 14 out of the 15 munition plants at the start of the Second World War in Russia were built, guess by who? Guess, just guess. By the Germans. German money, expertise, know-how, machinery, engineers, training, these were turnkey projects. All the Russians had to do was turn on the keys. They probably even had German engineers running the plants well into the war. I wouldn't be amazed. Some of them would turn online a few months before the war ended. Somebody wants to tell me that the German general staff had poor connections with the German bankers and the German industry, and nobody knew about these munition plants being hastily built in Russia just in time for the war. This is rule of thumb number one for the Illuminati and the bankers. Wars are made to load the government credit card with war loans. I mean, our personal family credit cards have a certain psychological limit. Parents realize that if they keep borrowing with that much, sooner or later their children will have to repay, their debts. So we will stop at a given level. There is a limit to the individual or family borrowing, but there is no such psychological limit to a government borrowing. The ministers are in the government today, they are out tomorrow. Who cares about how are these deficits and all this money onto the bankers going to be repaid? So the Rothschilds, the bankers, and the Illuminati behind them figured it out a long time ago that the fastest way to load the government credit card is through wars and through armament loans. But if you start the war unprepared, where one of the two opponents is a lot stronger than the other one, the war will finish in a week or in a month, and you won't be able to load the credit cards that much. That is why you have to make sure that the two sides are equally armed. And this is exactly so that the war would last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and you would end up with billions of dollars of money that is owned by the state to the private bankers. The American national debt rose exponentially during the war. Why did it rise? Because they make sure that the war would last many years. They armed both Hitler and Russia. This is the book about the Wall Street financing, the rise of Nazi Germany. How many companies were doing business with Hitler during the war? About 150 American companies?
About 100 by 1936. There were 100, and they were the same companies you mentioned were arming the Russians.
Exactly. The same companies that were arming the Russians were arming Hitler and were preparing for the future World War that was planned by the Illuminati probably 10, 15 years earlier. The best enemy money could buy. The whole Cold War was a smokescreen for all these years in order to clamp a tremendous security lid on the whole society so that the Illuminati can do with impunity all these secret projects that we'll be talking about here. All the underground, giant underground cities, all the secret space exploration and so on. This is the most incredible drawing. The primitive Russian Petryakov 4-engine bomber, a flying basket, basically, compared to the B-29, the best strategic bomber in the world at the time. Under the wing of the B-29, we have the German twin rocket engine, almost delta wing, supersonic rocket interceptor, the DFS-346, that probably went supersonic way before Chuck Yeager did, 5 years before Chuck Yeager did. These are Russian copies of advanced versions of the rocket-powered Messerschmitt .263, the twin-engine rocket Messerschmitt. The Comet is the 163, the single engine. This is a twin rocket engine Messerschmitt. This is an even more advanced interceptor fighter, and we see the best of the German rocket fighter suspended under the best of strategic bomber in the world with the insignia of the Russian Air Force. What a better example of a secret Illuminati transfusion and siphoning of information for which innocent or not innocent people like these Rosenbergs were shot to death for divulging American nuclear secrets to the Russians, at the time when behind the scenes the Americans were arming the Russians to the teeth. I have the photographs up here. They came from the Russian aviation magazine Flying Ace. Photographs. They didn't know what they were revealing. Photographs during the Cold War. How did these strategic bombers end up in Russian hands? I mean, they captured some of the German stuff, fine, but how did the American bomber end up in Russian hands? I heard that Rolls-Royce built a turbojet engine plant in Russia just in time for the Korean War, so that the Russian would be a good match for the Americans. The Americans already had their turbojet planes. The Russians could not build a turbojet engine under any circumstances. And recently in the British War Museum, the Imperial War Museum, I discovered photographs of the Nene turbojet engine built by Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce, the Russians are always getting the best of the best. Rolls-Royce built them as a present a whole turbojet engine plant, factory, just in time for the Korean War. I also heard stories that the Russians were given enriched uranium for their nuclear bomb, and it came, the fact was confirmed on a recent historical film that I have about the development of the German nuclear and rocket program. When the Russians couldn't figure it out, they were given a whole nuclear bomb by the Americans that was smuggled out in a giant suitcase of the Russian ambassador, straight on the plane from Washington to Moscow. The story is revealed in the works of Viktor Suvorov, an escaped GRU officer. GRU is the Secret Military Intelligence. Later on, the Americans gave the Russians a nuclear submarine because they were dumb enough to build their own one, to make them a real paper bear, a real enemy, a real bear, and not a paper bear. I mean, all this secret Illuminati arming of the Russians, it's not only the money, the best enemy that money could buy, it's the technology that was given to the Russians. I mean, if you open a Russian ICBM, you would find so many chips made in the West, you would find so many components made in the West. I mean, they have been secretly arming the Russians to make them a real enemy in order to have a Cold War, in order to claim this tremendous security that if you ask questions, they would shoot you first and ask questions later, in order for them to run their secret projects. The Spy magazine, with the incredible super secret governments that Madonna is displaying here, has an article on the Wackenhut Corporation, this private, secret, militia, and a CIA type of an intelligence organization. The Wackenhut SS, as Anthony Hilder jokes about them. The guys were secretly moving poison gas plant equipment to Iraq. And they depict a story where an 18-wheeler truck moves heavily guarded by armed Wackenhut guards that would pull out their rifles every time the truck stops for refueling in a truck stop. And the drivers would change and they would just stop for refueling. And they drove the stuff from Mexico all over the United States to somewhere and left the truck in an empty warehouse. And they got $20,000 for this day-and-a-half drive. Iraq was armed to the teeth by the Russians, by the Russian branch of the Illuminati, by the French. They gave them the Exocet missiles, the Russians gave them the MiG fighters, the scalar radars that would catch with the American stealth bombers. I mean, a stealth means not just radar absorbing paint on the wing, but it means Philadelphia invisibility technology, where you move in another space, time-wise, and you don't exist anymore in our space. But the Russians gave the Iraqis some scalar radars, fourth order or whatever, fifth order radars that would catch some faint emissions, and a lot of the bombers were shot down. Secret rumors. The Germans built the concrete underground bunkers, the desert U-boats, German concrete, 6 times as tough as normal concrete. 1 foot of German concrete is enough as almost 2 meters of normal concrete. Incredibly tough bunkers where the Iraqi divisions could sit it out forever. I mean, Iraq was heavily armed to the teeth. However, the thing that they did not calculate well was they did not expect them to chicken out that fast. They basically surrendered without much shooting, without any shooting. They expected the Iraqis to give a decent several months of fight. Another example of the Illuminati secretly arming both sides in a conflict. I mean, all these stories that I've heard about German ball bearings used for American fighter planes. They would grind off the swastika stamp on the side of the ball bearing and install it in the American fighter plane or bomber that's going to bomb Germany. Or high-grade American, high-octane aviation kerosene shipped by Standard Oil in American ships with German crews straight to Germany. Or the British Queen getting royalty fees from every German Luftwaffe bomber that was bombing London, because they had the patent rights on the ethanol additive to the high-octane bomber fuel. The Germans didn't have very good gasoline, so they were putting ethanol to raise the octane. So for every Luftwaffe bomber that was flying over London, the British royal family was getting royalty fees. This is a story I heard from England. I mean, the wars that we fight at the trench level, these are life and death struggles for survival, where people really fight to kill. If you go to a higher level of the bankers and the industrialists, I mean, they fight the war in order to make money and to sell more guns to both sides and to sell more armaments, to give more armament loans, and to load the credit cards of the governments more. From an even higher level of the Illuminati that run the planet, a war is done for completely different purposes. It's done to reduce the population, because very high on the Illuminati agenda is to lower the population to about, from 2 billion to about $500 million, to about 500 million, depending on the source of the information. I wouldn't be amazed that for the next Middle East war, it would be the Wackenhut Corporation that would provide the uranium enrichment facilities and the nuclear bomb capabilities for Iraq, if they have not done that already. Corporations like this one would be the key players in the future Middle East war. Anyway, back to the German saucers. German engineers built saucers for Franco. Some of them built a saucer for the Sultan of Morocco to take his harem on weekend flights, probably. Some of them escaped to Brazil and built saucers there for themselves or for the German colonies in Brazil and especially Argentina. The Russians captured a lot of German technology, and all these ghost rockets over Scandinavia in 46, 47 were German resuscitated technology that was run by the Russians. Here we have a brilliant article from the Saarbrücker Zeitung about the German saucer that crashed in northern Norway, in Spitzberg. A saucer that had its dashboard written with Cyrillic letters, that could fly to 160 kilometers altitude, which is 1.5 times the altitude of the space flights, the orbital flights of the Vostoks, the Voschots, the Geminis, and so on. And that could fly 30,000 miles, which is 3/4 around the globe. A saucer, about 50-meter diameter, with 46 jet engines on the periphery, spinning a silvery disc with a plexiglass cupola. The saucer crashed, probably another one came and picked up the crew, or it was an unmanned craft. This crash has been viciously debunked by American ufologists as an alien crash. And their line is that, well, actually these were aliens, but they didn't want to say that these were aliens, so they explained it away as a Russian saucer crash. The fact that the Russians have saucers is more dangerous to them than the fact that aliens crash their saucers on the planet. They want to cover this up at all costs. Advanced aerial devices were reported in large numbers in the Korean War. Obviously, both sides tested their saucers on the planes of the other side. What Kenneth Arnold saw in 1947, when the word flying saucer came into usage, were saucers that were assembled in the secret British saucer city in northwestern Canada. According to Renato Vesco, the Italian Werner von Braun, in his documentary book Intercept But Don't Shoot, piles and piles, giant pyramids of figuratively speaking, the information was dug out of the German underground bunkers. 9 kilometers of train load of boxcars from one facility alone, 16 kilometers from another facility. And he mentions that there were about 300 underground facilities in Germany at the time the war ended. You can count the boxcars that way. They were hauling boxcars for 2-3 years after the war. Imagine the number of people that were needed to just go through this information. All of these were crated in unmarked crates and shipped by ship through northwestern Canada, where a specially built giant city for 50,000 people was built in the wilderness. Renato Vesco cites Canadian papers about the railroads, the road system, the waterworks, and everything that was built for that city. And the first German craft started flying in 46, 47. This is what Kenneth Arnold quite probably saw. And Captain Mantell was not as happy with his plane. He probably came too close and saw the pilots wearing the same G suit inside as he was wearing, and that's why he was blasted clean out of the sky.
This city that was built in Canada, can you give us an idea where it was near?
Northwestern Canada. It's in the book Intercept But Don't Shoot. I can give you a call tomorrow. It's at home. It gives the locations, the name, the everything. John Searle built electrostatically powered flying craft for the British Royal Air Force. And on this photograph we see that this is a giant craft, that this are the command control panels here, and a table with a chair in front. This is not a small model. Nobody would put that detailed control panels in a model. This was probably a photograph of them building the real big craft based on that model, on this successfully tested flying model.
What did he do with it?
That's 1950s.
What did he do with it?
Go fishing, go bear hunting in the Arctic. We'll talk about it in a minute. These are photographs of John Searle testing his electrostatically powered craft. These are probably turbojet craft. A very bad quality photograph that I enlarge, and you can see the openings here, the exhaust openings that probably spin the outside of the craft. It looks like the Avro car. If this is the Avro car, then nothing more spinning other than centrally placed fan. And these are just the exhaust jets for venting air. A lot of patents were very much similar to the German design. Here we have a massive turbine, gas turbine, very similar to the German one, only the intake is from the front and the exhaust is on the back only, in order to give a more powerful forward thrust. This is a turbojet powered craft because I see the air intakes of the turbojet engines here, the 2 turbojet engines. These are the exhausts. The rocket-powered German craft did not have any air intakes here. And these are very important slits here. What I think happens is this outermost ring, which we can see here somewhat, everything beyond that ring spins, including these additional turbines here that are camouflaged, that are covered under these hatches. And the exhaust of these turbines comes at this particular place. We see that one cutout thing next to each turbine. And the thing is that they are asymmetrical. They go inside like this,
and then they come radially, which means that probably the exhaust gets out in a tangential direction, spinning the craft. This is a photograph that appeared in a news agency of a craft very similar to the German craft. These are the real Avro cars that they never unveiled to the public, other than some little designer leaks like this one. Anti-gravity flying devices were built in Maryland by an inventor that abandoned them. This is a typical Illuminati signature. They would quietly finance an inventor, and after they make sure that he has something and the thing works, they would abduct him, buy him off if they can, kill him off if they can't, abduct him for sure, and move him to a secret location to continue on with his research. In a Maryland barn, parts of a saucer-like flying machine were found by state police in an abandoned tool shed in Marley Park, Maryland in 1949. Air Force investigators were unable to find the inventor, who had built the craft before World War II and then had disappeared. This is the Illuminati signature. In many barns around the world, secret devices have been built. In the book Genesis by Harbinson, he talks at length about the airship scare of the 1890s being, again, a secretly financed Illuminati project. Some Wall Street bankers paid for these airships. They were built and tested. These were free energy powered or nuclear powered airships in combination with anti-gravity, according to certain reports that I found recently. And this is a typical signature of how the Illuminati work. They would constantly scout for the best inventors in the field. They would secretly finance them, and if they're really able to deliver something, then they would disappear. And one more invention would be hoarded inside the bottomless Illuminati safes, where they have things that are really incredible. I've heard stories that the Illuminati had a radio way back in the Napoleonic times, and they used the information to rig the London Stock Exchange, and in 3 hours the Rothschilds bought all the actions of they became the owners of the British government. At that time, 200 years ago, basically only the governments were in the business of issuing stocks. So what they did was they spread the false rumor that Napoleon was victorious at Waterloo, and he was about to march on London 2 days from now. Stock market crash, and they bought for nothing, for a penny to the dollar probably, all the stocks of the British government. The news came, the real news, and they had the real news through the radio immediately. The real news came through the much slower surface mail. 2 days later, the stock market promptly rebounded, but a different person was the owner of the British government. So a simple technology can allow an incredible competitive edge over your opposition, over your whatever competition. A guy in England, when I was there for this Wembley Arena conference, mentioned a book. I'm waiting for him to send me a copy of that. A book by a Scottish author who relates the story of somebody who made the wrong turn and entered into a room in the 1810s again, and found somebody sitting on a table in front of a strange looking kind of wooden crate with some knobs on it, talking to somebody else in the United States. And you could hear the voice coming from that crate. I mean, this was not a telegraphic simple. I thought at the beginning that, well, they were using a simple Tesla coil and some long antenna. Any goldsmith can build you a primitive Tesla coil, even in Roman, ancient Roman or Athens times, ancient Greek times, given the exact explanation how to do that. But I realized that the Illuminati had a lot more than that. They had a wireless radio voice communication. They probably asked for that from their alien tutors after their messenger was shot by lightning in Bavaria in the 1780s or 90s. And so the Bavarian government got all the pouch with all the documents of the secret Illuminati Brotherhood, and this was the biggest and the only leak, almost explosive decompression that happened with the secret Illuminati Brotherhood, and they took stringent measures for that never to be repeated. After that, they didn't need any messengers anymore. They were just talking to each other all over the world, and they can coordinate their campaigns and their bombings and their terrorist attacks. The Illuminati have been the biggest contract killer on the planet and the biggest terrorist contractor for the last several centuries. In my research of the German space projects and the German heritage after the war, I came to the strange book by Narciso Genovese about an Italian group that finally convinced the Pope to give them the files of Marconi. Marconi was killed by Duce for refusing to give him the death ray. This is a second story about the death ray developed on the planet. Marconi developed it. It was basically the same Tesla system for wireless energy transmission around the globe. But Marconi realized that if a plane flies into the emitter beam that comes from the power plant up to the ionospheric transmission layer, the crew would be microwaved. And so he was talking to Duce to give the humanity this free energy. And Duce said, well, Marconi, you don't understand the invention here. The side effect, this airplane crew microwaving is what I'm after. This is the ultimate weapon. Give me that weapon and we would rule the world. Marconi refused. He was promptly killed next morning by Duce. And his files ended up for safekeeping with the Pope. After the war, the surviving scientists convinced the Pope to give them the files. They wrote written oaths that they would not get any funding from any government and they would not use the technology for military purposes. Then the Vatican brokered a private financing to the amount of $180 million by oil magnates, private financiers, and heads of state. Very secret, probably on religious ground more than anything else. And the group descended on Argentina, bought a giant plantation, probably as big as a small European state, somewhere in the Argentinian Andes, and assembled quietly a top-notch group of world researchers. By 1952, they were flying their craft all over the world. Craft of a circular shape. So according to Narciso Genovese, an engineer on the project, who lived until recently in Tijuana, it was the Italians that buzzed Capitol Hill and the White House and Washington in general in that famous UFO flap of 1952. That resulted in the biggest press conference in the Pentagon. 350 journalists were there the next morning, after a dozen of these UFOs were buzzing and playing joyfully above the Capitol building. There is a Look magazine photograph of half a dozen of them hanging behind the illuminated dome of the Capitol building. In '56, they perfected the technology. This is a craft built by Tesla technology that was half a century old by that time, or more. A giant condenser. The inner cabin was insulated with glass insulators from the outer shell. These were some anti-gravity turbines that I have no idea how they were working, but I suspect that some of the free energy Illuminati dirigibles of the 1890s, probably again built by secret Tesla technology or somebody else's technology, were using similar, I mean, they look like, how should I say, not egg mixers, but egg beaters, but like these paint beater propellers that painters would use to prepare their paint in the bucket. And so they departed on Columbus Day 1956 on a flight to Mars in the company of several Martian craft. The Martians landed there about a year earlier and helped them iron out some of the details. For 2 hours they reached the moon, spent the night at the Martian colony there, Martian base on the moon, and then for a day and a half they reached Mars. There are very little technical details in the book, so I couldn't figure out from them whether this was a true story or not. However, the most revealing detail here is the strange trajectory that they took toward the moon and Mars. Rockets normally go on a figure-8 trajectory. They depart from the Earth, they go to the moon, they circle around, and they come back. If they enter the moon orbit, they fire the retro rockets, they enter the orbit, and then fire again. As an example. Yeah, I mean, this is too close here for... Anyway, so this figure-8 is the least energy expensive technology, trajectory. This strange trajectory with straight angles here is the most energy expensive technology. You can do that with a rocket, but you would need a fuel tank as big as the Queen Mary, or probably even bigger. I mean, maybe a giant fuel tank. I mean, it's impossible to do that with a rocket. This straight line trajectory here, this straight line, straight angle turn, this second sharp turn here, this another straight line turn here. This can be done only with a UFO. Only with a UFO, with an anti-gravity craft that controls the inertial mass and the gravity mass. It's hardly likely for a hoaxer to be that familiar with rocket mechanics in the 60s when this book was published for the first time in Mexico. This is the bigger Martian craft that landed there to help them. I don't know the details. And they spent a year on Mars. I'm sorry, 1 week on Mars. Very peaceful, loving society. Seas.
How long did it take to get to Mars?
A day and a half. It took them a day and a half to reach Mars. Because of the negation of the inertial mass, the flying saucer accelerates tremendously. People inside don't feel the G's. So you can reach tremendous speeds very quickly.
I'm confused because there's nothing lives on the moon or nothing lives on Mars.
This is what the party line says. I mean, the party line for many centuries has been claiming that the Earth is flat or that there is nothing beyond the Atlantic Ocean. Every new discovery has been covered up meticulously. Mountain passes in the Roman Empire were the biggest property. I mean, the most important information that was hidden by the public and the enemy armies. So were maritime straits and passageways. So were islands or continents later on. So are the physical conditions on the moon and all the other planetary bodies. According to contactee stories, all the planets of our solar system are populated.
Yeah,
but
they
not
don't have any oceans. They can't exist. It's impossible to exist without an ocean.
Well, we would see pretty soon. And let our eyes be the judge. Let's forget about the party line and leave our eyes to decide whether the king is wearing clothes or not. We will do that pretty soon. Anyway, in that brilliant article, Conquest of Space by Harry Stein, Chief Navy Range Operations, White Sands Proving Grounds, probably a German with a changed name. He mentioned, this is from June 57, Mechanics Illustrated, he mentions that there are about 12 industry projects on anti-gravity, secret projects on anti-gravity, plus another dozen of research institutes involved in anti-gravity. Several of them in one company alone, busily working on anti-gravity. In 1957, this was the biggest, the hottest secret field that everybody was working on. Back again to some conspiratology. I have several examples from recent history. About the discrepancies between the actual reality and people's willingness to admit to the ugliness and monstrosity of that reality. In Germany in the 30s and 40s, it was very unfashionable to talk about strange places where people were detained and you couldn't get out, And basically, well, maybe there were some kind of recreational facilities with barbed wire, like these show window camps that they would show to the International Red Cross and visiting turncoat American and other intellectuals, like the Jane Fonda's famous visit to the Hanoi Hilton prison for American pilots and so on. And even the wildest how should I say, even the wildest rumors in Germany were thousands of times shorter than the actual ugly reality. After the war, it turned out that these were not 1, 2, or half a dozen facilities, but these were thousands of concentration camps. That there was no industrial facility without a concentration camp, and no concentration camp without an industrial facility. That this was free slave labor for the motherland, for the fatherland, for the fatherland. The same way as the same way as on the other side of the curtain. In the 60s, the editor of the Novy Mir literary magazine, which was the booster rocket for Solzhenitsyn coming to fame, he used to make small social surveys of his friends, asking them around the campfire, making sure that there are no KGB informers around. He would ask them, well, how many do you think people disappeared in the Stalinist camps? And the wildest estimate he could get was about 10,000 in 37, 38, the worst years of the Stalinist purges. After some time, Solzhenitsyn wrote his book, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which depicted from getting up in the morning until going to bed at night, one day in the life of a prisoner. And he had 5,763 days more to go. This is how the book ends. A horrific book, a brilliant work of literature. Solzhenitsyn is probably the biggest genius and literary genius living on the planet. He's been ignored and debunked by the American media and establishment because he dared do the unthinkable on his Harvard University 79 commencement speech. He dared to compare the Russian evil empire with the American evil empire and come to the same common denominator, that both of these evil empires were godless societies, materialistic godless societies, that were bound to perform the same feats of evil. After that, he was listed a non-person, and he has never been interviewed or on any major press after that. He ceased to exist for the American media. That was it. The Illuminati said, that's it. And nobody ever heard a word about Solzhenitsyn. After he published the book One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and few others, people from all over the country started sending their personal histories, photographs, memoirs, family stories. He probably ended up with an archive that would fill in this room. And after a titanic work of several years, he published the first volume of the Gulag Archipelago. After several more years came the first 6 volumes of the monumental 12-volume book. And so what happened? Slowly the whole world realized that from the 10,000 inmates that went to the camps, according to the estimates of the most dissident of the Russian intellectuals in the 60s, the actual figure was 60 million that went to the camps and 20 million did not come back. So this is another example of how much the ugly Illuminati reality outpaces our ability to comprehend it and to accept it. Because it's like literary works like Lord of the Flies. People have difficulty accepting this side of human nature, which reveals to us that our polished social or intellectual veneer is just a very thin layer over a very brutal, animalistic nature underneath. And that one needs only a small pressure from outside in order to turn a peaceful society like these kids in Lord of the Flies, coming from the country with the longest democratic tradition on the planet, in few months of being alone on that island, into brutal savages that would kill without remorse. People are afraid to accept reality in these shades because it tells them that their, how should I say, their enlightened, their cultured nature is just a thin veneer over a brutal beast within. This explains how people in Germany were deluding themselves that, well, maybe there are a few hundred or thousand Jews in these recreational facilities with the barbed wire, when there were thousands of camps all over Germany. In the same way, Russians were deluding themselves about what was going on beneath the surface. And in the same way, people in the Western democracies are deluding themselves about what goes on in the underground Frankensteinian factories of the illuminated empire. Very important books on the KGB that I don't have a slide of them yet, by John Barron, the KGB and the KGB Today, reveal the workings of a secret intelligence organization, which is based on the same foundations as the CIA. Anyone who would like to get an idea how the CIA works has to read books on the KGB and vice versa. It turns out that for all these 50 years, there was another organization way more secret than the KGB that nobody knew anything about in Russia, the so-called GRU, the military intelligence organization, the intelligence branch of the general staff. It was so secret that not only cops, but KGB operatives in Russia would not know of its existence. Cops in Georgia were stupid enough to give registration license plates to their cars that were GRU dash whatever number. They didn't even know that this is the name of one of the most secret organizations. In Russia, in Stalin and Brezhnev years, if you mention the name GRU, they would beat the hell out of you till you tell the name of the guy who told you. And one by one, through beating them up, they would come to the GRU operative that probably got drunk and gave out the name. And then he goes out through the chimney. That chimney is the only way a GRU official would end his life. When they die, they are draped in a coffin with flag, and they are given funeral with all the military fanfare, but they go through the oven and the chimney. They are never buried because through dental charts and this and that, a person can be traced to some famous politician under a different name that lived in Western Europe or South America. When they screw up and talk too much, they die, but they are burned alive. And the induction ceremony of a GRU agent starts with a black and white film of such a live burning of a hapless somebody who talked. A brilliant book by Viktor Suvorov called Aquarium. I greatly recommend that to everyone who's interested into the conspiratorial view of the illuminated empire. These books would greatly help anyone to understand how the secretive organizations work inside the Soviet army and inside the Soviet military intelligence. Any book by Viktor Suvorov, like that famous Suvorov guy that beat the hell out of Napoleon. Viktor Suvorov. You can find them in any university library. Talking about disinformation, there are brilliant books on Soviet KGB and GRU disinformation campaigns. And they would help anyone to get an idea how the local spin control program works, how the Illuminati spin controllers in the United States work. One of the most famous jokes from the Brezhnev era was, a political joke was, that there is very little Pravda in the Izvestia and very little Izvestia in the Pravda newspapers. Pravda in Russian means truth and Izvestia means news. And we can paraphrase that joke for any other British or American newspaper. There is very little Pravda in the Washington Post, or very little Izvesti in the New York Times. These are the same Illuminati mouthpieces that basically give out the party line and only the party line. I've heard rumors that actually George Orwell's 1984 was not a prophetic warning, but possibly a blueprint for a future Illuminati society, or one way, possible way that the Illuminati could have built the terrestrial society. All the isms of the last 1 century were created by the Illuminati for their own purposes. The Unseen Hand by Ralph Epperson is a very important book on, it's an introduction to the conspiratorial view of history and reality. Anyone who would like to see deeper than the official shallow party line surface depicted in the media should go over these books. None dare call it conspiracy, a brilliant book about the secret levels of banking and Illuminati elite behind the secret government, secret political government, that run this country. In Des Griffin's book, Fourth Reich of the Rich, I got the shock of my life when I realized that all of, aside from the Illuminati paying for all the wars of the last 3 centuries in order to load the government credit card and to live happily ever after on the interest payments, it was the Illuminati that paid for the creation of the first Communist International of Marx and Engels, that financed Marx to write his Capital, Das Kapital, and that basically the Communist Manifesto, this 40-page of political program and blueprint for the World Communist Movement and the global communist revolution that was eventually to engulf the whole world. This was the Illuminati program for creation of a one world government, the New World Order, a century earlier, through a perpetual communist revolution. That would, on the side, create a one world bank for the bankers, so that then they would be able to print the money from one centralized place, rather than leaving every country to print its own currency. Incredible book. It was Wall Street that paid for the Bolshevik Revolution. Western agents were handing out money on Petrograd corners to hungry sailors to take part in the big Hollywood event, the upcoming revolution, and they really did take part. And the Kerensky government fell, and the rest is all history. Trotsky was the bagman for Wall Street, and all the money that was secretly funneled through the Armand Hammers and through the other actors were used for propping up of the Soviet regime. In the 30s, the Russian ministers were living with their suitcases packed because the situation was so desperate. They were waiting to be evacuated to the West anytime. Anytime. They were living with their suitcases packed. And I've realized in my conspiratorial view of reality that secret societies are not much different from the German secret and intelligence organizations. They had first the, what was it, the brown shirts, the SA. Then it got too big and they couldn't entrust too many people with the secret, so they made a thing within itself. The SS, I think, came after that. Then the SS got too big and they couldn't trust them anymore with all these secrets. So within the SS there was another secret society, the Waffen-SS, that appeared. It's like a new secret organization develops within the old one, so that the secrets could be confined to a smaller number. In the same way as the GRU appeared within the KGB, maybe there's other secret organizations within the GRU or the KGB, and others above them. So basically one realizes that conspiracies on this planet are organized on a hierarchical pyramidal structure, where on any other lower level, within that lower level, you would have the seed for the higher level. and only 5 to 10% of the lower level members would know about the existence and would be members of the higher level. It's much easier. It's much easier to become to move from the 1st to the 32nd degree Freemason than to become from the 32nd to the 33rd. The 32nd degree Freemasons would probably fill a big university-sized auditorium, sports arena in this country. But the 33rd degree Masons would probably fill this small room that we're sitting here. There are probably not more than 20, 30 people in the whole country. So, in the book, The Cosmic Conspiracy, Sandel, a very important author, and an extremely important book, talks about the extraterrestrial levels of these conspiracy structures. Edgar Hoover tried to pinpoint the 10 members on the Illuminati Politburo, and they pinpointed only 8 of them. And it says in the book, black and white, the other 2 were bordering on the paranormal. What does this mean, bordering on the paranormal? They count 8 people enter the room, the house. They do their sitting there, decide something, and after some time, 8 people leave. But inside, 10 people sit on the room. And this goes on and on and on, and they cannot pinpoint the other 2. Which is very simple. The other 2 simply beam down for the sitting and then beam up. Or just materialize for the sitting and then materialize up. All the secret societies, all the hermetic schools of thought, all the secret brotherhoods on the planet, the innermost circles of these secret societies, the innermost circle of adepts of the philosophical schools of thought, the innermost circles of temple priests, have been the people that have been always in contact with extraterrestrials. Secrecy is needed for many reasons. Positive reasons are that the planet has to be kept in isolation in order to develop cultural diversity. If we are swamped with extraterrestrial contact from the very beginning, then we all would be wearing t-shirts and Japanese Seikos and transistor radios under our arm and jeans. Exactly what happened with a primitive aboriginal culture somewhere on the islands or in the Amazon jungle after the coming of the Western civilization. They lose their original ways and they internalize the ways of clothing, the ways of life, the ways of food of the more advanced civilization. So in order to breed diversity in the universe, it is nice to have a country develop for a long time isolated, like Japan developed isolated, and that's why they have such a brilliant cultural and ethnic singularity. That's why they're so nicely different from the rest. So this is the good reason behind the secrecy. But the bad reason is that with all these secret organizations, if one wants to abuse the secrecy and abuse the technology, the higher knowledge and technology that he is constantly given, there is no boundary to the depths of falling that one can do. So in the cosmic conspiracy, it becomes obvious that 2 of the 10 Politburo members of the Illuminati are either extraterrestrials or even supermaterial celestial beings that have non-material bodies. So I always use this pyramid as a metaphor for the conspiracy structures, for the management hierarchies, for the management pyramids that go on the different conspiracy levels on our planet. Then from a certain point on, they go beyond in outer space to the neighboring planets and stars in our portion of our galaxy, and up and up and up to the highest levels of management in the universe. And I've discovered many such competing pyramids, not just one, that influence the development of our planet. A lot of books have been written on the Illuminati. Most of them are basically whitewashing, party line, cover-up stories. But in some of them, very interesting information can be obtained. The second book by Sandel, The Vindicator Scroll, talks about a lot of connections between ancient terrestrial cultures and alien beings. Morals and Dogma Should we stop the tape now?
It might be a good time.
Yeah.